Hey everybody, welcome to your horoscopes for the week. These are the horoscopes for the week ending September 3rd, our last week before we move into the shadow period of our last Mercury retrograde of the year. Although actually, as I say that, there might be a little tiny bit of one at the very end of the year, as in we might actually end and begin the year with a little bit of a Mercury retrograde, but we'll see when we get there. But this is the official last full Mercury retrograde of the year. It will be in Virgo and it will be starting at the end of next week, so we don't want to spend too much time on it this week because we really want to enjoy this week before all that craziness happens. So we'll pretend it doesn't happen, at least until the very end of the week, on the 3rd, when we officially move into the shadow period of the retrograde before it starts the following week on the 10th. So let's enjoy our time while we have it. And in the meantime, the planets are doing a crazy dance this week. Lots of stuff going on. So let's go ahead and bump on into it and see what we got going on. And we're going to start as we always do with Aries. Aries focus is on family, those that you love this week. For Aries women, especially, I think this is a perfect place to be focusing your energy because most of the Aries women that I know are very family centered people. And so having opportunities to be able to spend that time with family is definitely always a good thing. We still have Jupiter in Aries, of course, in still retrograde. I believe that retrograde is going to be ending pretty soon, not this week, but in the next few weeks. And it'll move forward again. So that is good news. The not so great news, unfortunately, though, is Jupiter's opposition with Mercury as Mercury moves into Libra. That retrograde is going to start in Libra, but it is a Virgo retrograde. So a couple of days in the beginning, affecting Libra, but the majority of it is going to be in Virgo. This week's Jupiter's opposition with Mercury creates a little bit of a challenge, but it also provides a bit of a solution for that challenge at the same time, which is kind of convenient as Mercury's focus is on those who love and support you. And when it seems like those that you love are not the same people as those that support you, or you find yourself in a position where you're trying to get support from those that you have gotten support from before, or you have supported in your mind, you think that they should be supporting you. Instances always come up where that's not the case. And Mercury's focus really is on communication. And I feel like this week, especially before we go into that shadow period, it's sort of a reminder of how we deal with these types of situations. Now, I've seen a lot of issues in terms of communication, or I should say lack of communication in this case. When you need support and those people aren't there to support you, oftentimes what happens is you don't say anything. You sit and stew in it. You overthink it to death. You get very, very angry, but you don't tell the person why you're angry. And this is really where everything just goes south at this point. If you are in need of support and you've mentioned, hey, I'm in need of support, and the person says, well, I'm sorry, but I'm unavailable today, I can't support you. Rather than getting upset about it, it's a good time to ask that person, okay, if today is not good, do you have another time later on? By doing this, you're sort of omitting your need to get angry about it, but you're also giving that person another chance to be able to come through for you, if that makes sense. If this is one of those situations where it seems like you're supporting somebody and supporting somebody and supporting somebody, this happens all the time, and they're just never there to support you, you want to say something to that person. Now, this doesn't mean that they're going to completely change their behavior, but you at least want to give them an opportunity to change their behavior, because you never know. Maybe they don't realize that this is such a big problem for you. And because they don't realize it's such a big problem for you, they're not going to fix the problem. So you definitely want to give them an opportunity to do that. If we get into a situation, of course, where you've done all that and you've given them the opportunity, well, then you want to take a look at whether or not supporting this person really is worth your while anymore, because in many cases, it really should be a two-way street. And when it's not a two-way street, um, we won't even talk about how unfair that is. It's just draining. In all honesty, you're being drained and not getting any kind of reciprocation for that. So that is something that you want to address for sure. I know a lot of Aries, both male and female, but I think this is predominantly female, find themselves in this situation where they're constantly expending energy for other people and not necessarily seeing a return in that. And women especially have this annoying tendency, for lack of a better way of saying it, of rather than expressing the issue, just kind of sort of holding it in. And when somebody asks, especially if it's the person they ask, what's the matter? They go, nothing, right? Because you expect them to know right away what your problem is. And guess what? That never happens. Okay. So you're really making this more difficult for yourself than you really should be. And by doing that, you're making it harder on yourself emotionally, a lot harder on yourself. You're sapping your happiness when you think about it, and that's just not something that you want to do. So that is what I have for you guys this week. And we are going to go ahead and move on to Taurus. We still have Uranus and Taurus. Uranus just turned retrograde and will continue to be retrograde into the latter part of the year. We are, of course, still in a T-square with, pardon me, with Venus as well as Saturn. Now, Venus is going to move on out of this, and the T-square will be done by the end of the week, which thank goodness for that, because with the Sun and Mercury and now Venus moving in there, that's just been really a major challenge for these three signs. So it's nice to see that moving back into just a square between Uranus and Saturn starting next week. But this week, we still have to deal with the dang thing, unfortunately. Focus is on relationships this week, and Uranus's retrograde is actually kind of interesting. Uranus is all about being rebellious. It's about handling things differently. It's about going against the grain. When we reverse that or retrograde that, we're looking at going back to dealing with certain things in a more traditional way, ways that have been used before. And so when we're talking about relationships, and Venus is very much poised and looking at your career relationships, well, Saturn's very much focused on relationships inside the home. This really creates this, I'm torn between these two different places here. And being torn in between two different places is always a challenge, because it really feels like it's hard to focus on one thing or another. You sort of feel like you're always constantly focused on both things, which is definitely going to be a little bit of a challenge. Now, this challenge is going to get way bigger, unfortunately, when the moon moves into Scorpio Thursday and Friday, and this becomes another fixed grand cross. We had a fixed grand cross last month. We have another fixed grand cross this month. We're probably going to look at least one more, maybe even two more towards the end of the year, also when we get into Scorpio season and the moon moves into Leo. So luckily, because the moon is involved, it's not a bunch of heavy hitter planets. This isn't something that's going to be happening forever. It is something that comes in for a day or so and really shake things up and makes it all crazy, and then it leaves, which is good. But with the moon bringing Scorpio's focus on the inner closet into this mess, we're really picking up and triggering some old pain here, which is difficult. So if you're looking at challenges within your career relationships, and you're looking at challenges within your home relationships, this is sort of going to blow things up and make it feel like you are literally just dealing with challenges with people everywhere. And when we are poised on the verge of a Mercury retrograde, that can be a really scary thing. The good news is that Uranus is also aspecting planets in a very positive way, and this is going to help you through this really big challenge. Uranus is grand sextile with Pluto as well as Neptune is helpful. With Pluto's focus on the mind and how you think about things, and Neptune's focus is right in between those you love, oddly enough, a problem already, right? As well as the home. This actually is sort of brilliant when you think about it, because these planets are sort of coming together and showing you, one, how your mind is playing out and making this problem worse. Now, I know everybody is like totally like, oh, how could your mind make it worse? We all know that it can. Let's not get all excited over something that we know. Every single one of us has a tendency to blow things out of proportion here. You spend too much time thinking about it, you're obsessing over it. You all of a sudden this little itty bitty problem becomes this humongous deal, right? And it's all in your head, so to speak. And it's not that the actual thing that's going on is in your head, but how big of a deal it becomes can be exasperated by where you are going in your head. So rather than sitting in this space where you're like, oh, I'm having trouble with this person over here, and I'm having trouble with this person over here, and there is literally nowhere I can go where I'm not having trouble with somebody, it's time to separate all of these problems and work on one problem at a time. Are you having a communication problem with somebody at work? Let's sit down with that person and talk it out and see if we can't fix it or find a solution for it. Same thing with at home. If you're having a communication problem at home, what do? You sit down with your partner or your child or whoever it is, and you say, hey, we're having a problem. Let's come together and see if we can find a solution. By doing something, by being proactive about the problem, you can omit the problem, which is the first step. You want to try and omit the problem or fix the problem. Problems that aren't fixed just fester and become bigger problems. And that's something that we're really trying to avoid here, especially with all the challenges that are going on right now. So this aspect becomes really helpful in a big challenge where things just sort of get blown out of proportion and get really confusing, especially around that fixed grand cross, because that emotional moon coming in is really going to start bringing up triggers of old pain that is associated with these things. And if you're being triggered, chances are these are things that you really just need to kind of work on, bring it up to the surface, embrace it, accept it, let it go, release it like a balloon up into the sky, and just say, okay, I'm not going to allow this pain to control my actions from here on out anymore. It sounds easy, and it can be easy. It really just depends on you, the individual, and whether or not you are willing to let that pain go. So that is what I have for you guys. I know it's a little bit crazy, but it's only a little bit crazy for a couple of days, and then things are going to smooth out a little bit more after that. So yes, that's what I have for you guys. And we're going to go ahead and move on to Gemini. We got all kinds of crazy, wonderful things happening in Gemini. And we're going to start with the good, okay? Because that's definitely a lot more fun than the bad, right? So we have Mars in Gemini officially this week. I moved in last week, first full week of Mars in Gemini. With the Geminis that I know, they really don't need any more energy than they already have, but a little bit more energy is always good nonetheless. And Mars focus is very much on relationships, Gemini's relationships. Now, Mars is one of those really tricky planets. It's really all about ambition and growth in many cases, but it's also a very aggressive influence. And when you're talking about in relationships, that's kind of tricky because this can actually promote some aggressive tendencies going on within your relationships at this time, and bringing those things to the surface, because these are things that really need to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. So we're talking these little things that get that kind of come up that annoy the crap out of you, and they start off being really annoying, and over time it's just one of those things that sort of makes you explode, if that makes sense. Now, um Mars is in a square with Mercury at this time. So sorry about that. I'm not Mercury, I'm sorry, with the sun at this time. And that actually is going to become a T square by the end of the week when the moon moves into Sagittarius. So the moon comes in and takes this small challenge and amplifies it and makes it way, way, way bigger. And especially if the moon is involved, it's going to be an emotional challenge, unfortunately. When we're talking about a square between Mars and the sun's focus is really on career this week, and Mars focuses on relationships. So we're talking about our relationships within our career. And the moon comes in and makes this a much bigger challenge, focuses on self. And so this sort of brings up issues between yourself, your own personality issues, so to speak, and somebody else's personality issues. And oftentimes, it's not whether you have a good personality or a bad personality. Even the best personality in the world can clash with another individual. And so when you have a personality clash like this becomes a problem when the two of you cannot get along with each other. Now, Mars could make this aggressive, and that's what you really want to watch out for. Aggression, especially within your job, is really not a good idea. You're looking at the possibility of a loss of that job, and that's not something that you really want to entertain at this time, especially if you need that job, right? So really, it is all about taking a look at the responsibility that you have in that relationship. What are you doing, or what could you do to be able to eliminate that frustration for the other person? And by doing that, because let's face it, this is the only thing you have control over, you don't have control over them. By doing that, you also provide an opportunity for them to see that you are trying to work with them. Maybe they might try and work with you a little bit. There is even the possibility of sitting down and having a conversation and saying, okay, what is it about me that bothers you the most, so that I can work on that, so we can make sure that we can work together. And by offering that up, you can also ask that person to do the same thing. And then you're sort of both working on something that will help the relationship together in this case. Now, the good news is Mars trine with Mercury, and Mercury is all about communication. So in terms of sitting down and communicating with people, this is something that you definitely want to be doing, especially if the planets are lining up in this way. Mars focus is all about those that support you. So this adds another element to it. There are those out there who may have been in this situation before, and when you sit down and talk to them, they also may be able to give you some very helpful and friendly advice to help with that situation. And you never want to discount that, because that's definitely something that can be helpful for you if you choose to listen. Okay, you have to obviously choose to listen, right? And then, of course, we also have a sextile between Mars and Neptune is retrograde. Neptune's focus is on the home and is generally about our intuition and how we use those intuitive abilities. And this is really actually pointing towards using your intuition to help you get through this situation. Now, the intellectual signs like Gemini are not known for their intuitive abilities. Logic a lot of times gets in the way of your intuition because if it doesn't make sense, what's the point of it? And unfortunately, none of these abilities make any sense at all. Even to this intuitive, or I'm sorry, this intellectual person right here. So, um, that being said, you have to remove that. You have to set your logic aside, whether it makes sense or not, and really just pay attention to what you're intuitively getting. By doing that, you actually give yourself an opportunity to be able to see what's under what somebody, the behind the words that somebody is using. So if you're dealing with somebody who happens to be really egotistical, really cocky, really full of themselves, your intuition can actually show you a person who's really broken, who's really lost, and they're using that form of communication to sort of cover that up a little bit. And when you know where that's coming from, you have something else to work with. So instead of reacting to what it is that they're doing and how they're acting and what they're saying, you have an understanding of where they're coming from. And you can work the person a little bit differently. I'm not saying manipulate them. I'm just saying that you can work your communication around to be able to sort of make that person think, take them out of their automatic response of ego and instead think about what it is that they're doing, maybe even make a different decision. You never know what the outcome can be. So this is really about not going with your first instinct, not going with your first emotional reaction in these particular tendencies. Instead of going towards your initial emotional reaction, you're looking for ways to change the way that you play the game instead of playing the game the way it's always been played, or allowing somebody else to control how the game is played, because we don't want to do that either. So that is what I have for you guys. And we're going to go ahead and move on to Cancer. Focus is on money for Cancers this week, as well as long-term goals. Specifically, let's talk about your financial long-term goals here. There's no planets that influence Cancer this week, which is actually not a bad thing because it's, well, there's just a lot of crazy planet stuff going on this week. So it's in some cases, it's just better to not have that. And this is one of those cases. But in terms of focusing on your long-term financial goals, it's always important every now and then just to take stock of where we are financially. Are we where we want to be? Are we making the money that we want to be making? Are we investing that money in the right places? Are we saving enough money? There's a million different things that come up with the working of money. I mean, it just blows my mind, to be honest with you. This week, as you're taking stock of where you want to be, it's also a good idea to make a plan, because if you're not where you want to be, obviously you want to create a goal plan to get to where you want to be. And this is really where we're at for this week. So this, of course, would include investments. It would include savings. It would include making sure that you have enough money to pay your taxes at the end of the year, or enough write-offs to kind of sort of bring down paying that money to the IRS at the end of the year. Different things like that. Now, for Cancers, money is security. Without that security of the money, Cancers tend to feel in a very nervous space. And really, this is what it's all about. It's about avoiding that nervous space altogether and keeping yourself secure as much as possible. And when you have the Lilith or dark moon influencing these goals, you really want to pay attention to not um, not planning your goals in the same way that you always have. This actually provides an opportunity for you to look a little bit deeper into what your goals are and give yourself the opportunity to be able to say, you know what, maybe I'd like to invest in this rather than what I would normally invest in. Maybe I'd like to save my money in an annuity instead of a savings account. So it sort of broadens out, or it's asking you to broaden out your ideas on how your money can work for you. Because it's not just about making the money, it is about taking the money that you have made and seeing what it can do for you. And that's really what good financial planning is all about when you think about it. And if you can't do this, or don't have the knowledge, or don't know what to do, that's okay. That's why they have financial planners out there to help you out with that. So that is what I have for you guys this week. And we're moving on to Leo. Leo's focus continues to be on career, and Venus continues to be in Leo, at least for this week. Venus is moving out of Leo, actually, not the end of this week, but bumping out of Leo next week, which is good. That T square between Uranus and Saturn will continue up until towards the end of the week. And we're left with just an opposition between Venus and Saturn. So it just kind of sort of bumps Uranus out of it and makes it a much smaller challenge, which is good. I mean, if anything, that's the good news, right? Venus is all about creativity, and that sort of creative flair that you do have with Venus is helpful in terms of your career, because it helps you to really come up with some creative ideas on how you can expand in your career, whether that's making more money, whether that's organizing what you've got going on, coming up with some new ideas that might help you generate more leads, things of that nature. Unfortunately, creativity is a little bit stifled with the T square that is happening this week between Uranus and Saturn, both planets, of course, being retrograde. When Uranus is retrograde, it takes that sort of rebellious and let's go against the grain and do things differently out, and sort of comes back to say, let's do things in a traditional way, the way that we always have before, or revisit some of the ways that we used to do this, that maybe we stopped doing it, if that makes sense. So when you're talking about how you used to do things, you're just bringing up ideas to see if they will continue to fit now, or maybe it's something that you've moved past. But it's always a good idea to kind of sort of look into those things just to see if there's something useful there. With Saturn being all about responsibility, and that retrograde happening in terms of responsibility and personal responsibility, this is also very interesting. With Saturn's focus being on the mind, the responsibility really is on you. It comes down to taking personal responsibility for how you think about what is going on around you. So, for instance, if you are in the process of um, of coming up with some creative ways to advance your business, you do want to look at your own responsibility to how you think about those things. So, for instance, if you are planning um, if you're planning a promotion, or if you're planning to try and get a promotion, and your mind is going to this place where it's like you're not good enough and there's like 10 other people that would be better, and blah blah blah, your responsibility to yourself is really to get a hold on how your brain is thinking about those things. And I know it sounds easy, and it really isn't easy, but it is useful, because you are just simply reminding yourself and reminding your brain, hey, We decided not to think that way before. Let's change that to something that is a little bit more helpful and positive. By doing this, by constantly doing this, you take charge of your automatic thoughts. You take charge of how your brain just automatically thinks about things. And when you take charge, your brain starts to work for you instead of you being the victim of your brain, which is definitely no fun at all, really. Now, that opposition remains as we get to the end of the week, even though Venus is no longer in a square with Uranus. So this responsibility to how you think continues to be a big focus for Leos until Venus moves out of Leo next week. So it's a little bit of a challenge, but it's nothing that you guys can't handle. Most Leos have a very positive outlook on life, and they hide very well that they don't have a very positive outlook on themselves. So this really is sort of showcasing, stop acting like you do and start being who you're portraying yourself to be, if that makes sense. So that is what I have for you guys this week. And we're going to move on to Virgo because, of course, we are in Virgo season. And this is our last week without a Mercury retrograde. The shadow period begins on the 3rd, right at the end of the week. Now, Mercury is in Libra and will start that retrograde in Libra, but of course, it is a Virgo retrograde. So don't think that it isn't going to come back into your sign later on. Trust me, it will. Maybe not the first week, but it'll definitely be there for the few weeks after that. But for now, we're looking at the sun being in Virgo. And the good news is that the sun moves into this beautiful trine with Uranus. Uranus is very much retrograde right now. Yes, we're talking ass backwards here. Is very much in retrograde right now and focus on relationships. And when the sun is focused on career and in a trine with a planet that is focused on relationships, of course, we're looking at your business relationships here. And being that this is a trine, this is a very positive aspect. So it is helping you to build the right relationships that will make sure they align with your career in the way that they're supposed to. These are relationships that are going to help move your career towards the direction that you want it to be in. And of course, it's always good, especially for Virgos, to align with the correct relationships that are going to line up for their career goals, which is fantastic. Really important for Virgos to work with people who either have a very similar way of looking at things or that have put the same type of energy into things that the Virgo does, because Virgos do have a tendency to like perfection, like a lot, especially when it comes to how they're making their money. So that is a good thing. Now, the annoying thing is the square with Mars that is definitely apparent all week long. And at the very end of the week, once we hit that shadow period on the 3rd, the moon moves into Sagittarius to make this square a T square. So what is it that we're really talking about here in terms of it's sort of interesting how this trine is all about your business relationships. The T square and Mars position in the T square is also in relationships. So this creates a challenge in your business relationships, even though you've got something that's very helpful towards your business relationships. So did you think it was going to be perfect? Well, I'm here to tell you it never is, right? Nothing is perfect, but it does sort of balance things out a little bit. You do have some relationships that are difficult or challenging. Those relationships that are helpful tend to balance that out a little bit. And my advice on this really is to pay attention to the traits in the relationship that works well and make sure that they're in those traits are in the relationship that isn't. And if it's not, the relationship either needs to be fixed or possibly even reevaluated. What is very interesting is when the moon moves in and makes this a much bigger challenge, and the moon's focus is all on self. And it may, the two things will come up with this. Either one, you will actually look at maybe how you might be responsible for the challenges that are coming up in this relationship, or it may be that you're called out onto the carpet as being the person that is responsible for the challenges in this relationship. Now, like I said, Virgos are perfectionists. They demand perfection with everything that they do. And so that right there can maybe indicate that you might be the problem. Maybe you're asking too much or you're demanding too much from people. That's possible, okay? But if you know for certain, and make sure you evaluate and look at yourself and make sure that this is true. If there is nothing that you can take responsibility for in terms of this relationship, don't take responsibility for something that is not your responsibility. This is really what this challenge is all about. You want to make sure that you are taking on the correct responsibility here and not taking responsibility for other people's messes, okay? Because that happens an awful lot. But we don't want to ignore the fact that, yes, there are times when we are the problem, and we need to evaluate that, because if you just eliminate that relationship and you're the problem, guess what? You're going to have another problem in the next relationship. So just make sure that there's balance there, that you're making sure that the issues aren't coming from you, or that you're not creating the issue in some way, but don't take on responsibility for other people's problems either. Ain't nobody got time for that, right? Especially you Virgos. So that is what I have for you guys this week. And we're going to move on to Libra, and it's all about Mercury for Libra. We're in our last full week before the shadow period of the Mercury retrograde, which is going to start in Libra, I'm afraid. I think the first week of the retrograde actually does take place in Libra. The shadow period really is the week before Mercury officially goes retrograde. So we are entering the shadow period at the very end of the week on the 3rd. The actual retrograde starts at the very end of next week on the 10th. So let's enjoy not being in a Mercury retrograde while we have it, right? Focus is on those that love and support you, and we have some good things and some not so great things going on, of course. So we're going to start with the challenge as Mercury moves into opposition with Jupiter. Now, this is actually kind of interesting. Jupiter is retrograde, so that sort of growth and expansion feel of Jupiter is sort of, I can't think of the word that I want to use right now, but basically we're not growing and expanding. We're sort of doing the opposite. We're not really doing much at all, which is kind of frustrating. And Mercury is all about communication. Now, with your focus on those that support you in opposition with a planet that is retrograde, and focused on those that you love, sometimes it feels like no matter how many people you have in your life that are supposed to support you, sometimes it just feels like they're not supporting you. And this happens a lot in relationships, in families, in terms of couples, for multiple different reasons. It's not always that the other person just is using you. It's not always that the other person just doesn't care. Sometimes they're just not available, or they just can't. But this is why Mercury is such an important influence in this particular challenge, because if you don't say anything, nothing ever changes. And that's really what the lesson is all about here. Most people hold it in, they don't say anything, they hope that eventually you'll see that they're in pain, and that just doesn't happen. The world doesn't work like that. We actually tend to blind ourselves to everything that we don't want to see or don't want to deal with in the moment. So it's really a good idea to communicate about that. If you need support and you're not getting it, sit down with the person that you're looking for support from and explain to them just how important it is for you to get that help. It's possible that the person can't help you today, but that doesn't mean that they can't help you tomorrow. Or they might not be able to help you right now, but they may be able to help you in a few hours. You really just sort of have to negotiate that. But sitting there and saying nothing is not going to be helpful for you at all. Now, the good news is as Mercury moves into a trine with Mars, Mars energy is fantastic. Everybody needs a little energy boost, and that's really what Mars is all about. And when Mercury moves into a trine with Mars, Mars is all about relationships. And the energy behind your relationships is really important here. And so when you're in an aspect like this with a very energetic planet, it's also showing you that you may be looking to one person to support you and almost obsessing over the fact that that one person isn't there to support you. And this trine comes in and says, hey, you don't have just the one person to support you. You have this massive support system. Step out of what you have to have right now and broaden things out and look at how much support you really have. I mean, most of us have a lot more support than we think that we do. It just is depending on where our mind, what direction our mind is focused on in the moment. As we get to the very end of the week and the moon moves into Sagittarius, into a sextile with Mercury, this actually is really helpful because it shows you that the biggest supporter that you have is you. In some cases, you may be thinking you really need somebody, but the truth is that you don't need anybody. You can take care of it just as well by yourself as if you had somebody helping you out. So think about it in those terms. It can be a little bit difficult, a little bit challenging to feel like it's all on you, but let's look at this in the way that it should be looked at, Libras. Who would do it better than you anyways? That's what you have to look at. A lot of times you're looking for support and then you get the support and then the person doesn't do it right anyways. You wind up having to go back and do it yourself. You can avoid all that by simply knowing that the biggest support system that you have really is you and you alone. You really don't need anybody else to support you. So that is what I have for you guys this week. And we're moving on to Scorpio. Things are pretty quiet in Scorpio up until about Thursday and Friday when the moon moves into Scorpio. And because there are planets and all the other fixed signs, we are looking at another fixed grand cross for at least a couple of days, Thursday and Friday specifically. Now, moon in Scorpio is difficult no matter what. It's an emotional planet, an emotional sign with focus on self. And there's a little bit of focus on the inner self, the inner emotional self. This is probably going to be a bit of an emotional nightmare, but I think it doesn't have to be as big as we make it either. But let's go ahead and take a look at what we're looking at here. When I say fixed grand cross, we have an opposition with the moon and Uranus, as well as an opposition between Venus and Saturn. All planets square each other. That means that there is a grand cross. And in this case, because they're all in fixed signs, it's a fixed grand cross. Now, fixed signs really avoid change. They're very anti-change. I wouldn't call them lazy. They go at a pace that is good for them. There's no reason to hurry through what they're doing. They just sort of take their time and get things done right. And there's really nothing wrong with that until it becomes a fixed grand cross. And then it feels like nothing is happening. Nothing is moving forward. No matter how hard you're working, it's all stagnant. And you just, there's nothing you can do to sort of push things to get them going. And that's really frustrating. I think for a lot of people, most people get really frustrated with that. Um, the good news, the good news is the moon's sort of sextile with the sun, which shows you that even though it seems like there's chaos going on around you within your relationships, within the setting of your goals, within your career, in some cases, the relationships within your career, the moon sextile with the sun sort of showcases where you tend to shine in your career. And when it comes down to it, your relationships and everything that's going on outside of that isn't necessarily not important. We don't want to say that it's not important because that's not true. It's just that there are other things that are more important than dealing with the relationship craziness that's going on right now, if that does make sense. Communication is always, of course, very important when it comes to relationships. If something is bothering you, you definitely want to communicate it about it. Scorpios are not known for being good communicators. I mean, there are some out there that are, but for the most part, they tend to hold it in. And all you're doing is creating more emotional junk for that emotional closet of yours. And that's really not something that you need to do. Not only does it affect you physically after a while, but you can only hold on to so much before it becomes too much. And that's really something that you want to be aware of. So communication is really important. If something is too much, find a way to communicate it. And if you have communicated about it before and nothing happened, you didn't communicate it about it in the right way. You want to make sure that you're communicating in a way that gets your point across without being too aggressive. Because if you approach it in too aggressive way, you wind up with somebody who's being defensive and not wanting to understand where you're coming from because they're too busy defending their position. You want the defense mechanism out of there. It doesn't have to be a big production. Rather than coming up to somebody and saying, hey, you're not being helpful to me, which is aggressive, you can go up to the person and say, hey, excuse me, I need some help and I need specific help in these areas. And this is what I need you to do. Can you do that for me? And negotiate. This way the person knows exactly what they need to do. They have a list of things to do. They know exactly what's expected of them. You have less of an opportunity for things to not go the way you need them to go, if that makes sense. Again, Thursday, Friday, the moon moves out, everything just sort of quiets down again, which is exactly what you need to get things done. So that's what I have for you guys. And I'm going to move on to Sagittarius, where we're going to end the week with the moon in Sagittarius. Before we get there, we got nothing in Sagittarius, which is good. This moon coming into Sagittarius, though, however, is going to shake things up quite a bit. Focus is on self and in some cases the past this week. And the moon's focus on self really is actually a big one. When we're talking about emotional focus on self, this can be a little bit daunting and difficult, if that makes sense, because really it's really hard for anybody to focus on themselves in such a way where they're focused on self-improvement. A lot of us don't want to deal with self-improvement. We want to believe that we're fine just the way that we are and we don't need to improve, and because we're human beings, well, that's just a bunch of baloney, and that's not how that works, right? We all have to improve in some way, shape, or form and take responsibility for our own bullshit, plain and simple. And this is really what the moon in Sagittarius is all about this week. Moving into a T-square with the sun and Mars creates even more of a little bit of a challenge, because with the sun's focus on career and Mars focus on relationships, this really is all about how we are doing in terms of our career goals and how we're doing within our relationships. And when you look at when you're forced to look at yourself in terms of relationships, be they your career relationships, your family relationships, your friends, whatever, um, again, we're talking about something that's really uncomfortable, okay? You don't want to have to look in the mirror at yourself and go, oh my God, this is how I'm screwing all this up. But you know what? We all do it. We all make mistakes and we all screw things up. And it's really easy for all of us because let's face it, there's not a sign that doesn't do this. It's really easy for all of us to point the finger at other people as the reason why there is a problem. It's a lot harder to take that finger and point it back where it belongs, at you, and to see where you might be causing some of these problems or where you might be avoiding the fix of these problems, if that makes sense. So it is a really big challenge because that's definitely not something that's easy for anybody to do. Necessary, absolutely necessary. Everybody has to take a bite of that bad sandwich that they make every now and then. It just sort of it sort of helps us to be able to stop making bad sandwiches eventually. Although we're human, so we're not going to do it totally completely. But when it comes down to it, life is all about self-improvement. It's about becoming a better person than you were yesterday. And if you did that every single day of your life, think about how far you would be eventually in terms of a person that is self-aware, a person that is non-destructive, a person that is open, honest, and full of love. And really, in my opinion, what our main goal and our main lesson in life is to be able to approach life with love, even though life is not a loving thing, if that makes sense. So yes, that's your challenge for this week, guys. So have fun with that. And we're going to go ahead and move on to Capricorn. Capricorn still focused on the mind. Pluto very much playing in Capricorn still and in retrograde. With focus on the mind, this is very interesting. And Pluto being your source of power and transformation, it may feel like it's impossible to change the way you think about certain things. And that Pluto's influence in that way really does make it a lot more difficult to change the pessimistic way that you Capricorns may be thinking, because pessimism really is a Capricorn trait. At least that's a trait that they're known for. Not to say that other signs aren't pessimistic, that's not true. But Capricorns just seem to be that way. They always look at the things in the negative like they're prepared for the negative all the time, and that is okay. But after a while it starts to get a little, I don't know, you feel like you're in a negative place all the time, and that really doesn't promote success. It doesn't promote growth. It doesn't promote happiness in any way. When you're talking about how the mind works and how Capricorns think, it is really important to promote healthy, positive mindsets as much as possible, even with Pluto being retrograde, and that sense of being able to transform anything feels like it's completely and totally lost to you. It just means you have to work a little bit harder. It does not mean that it's completely and totally impossible. The good news is Pluto lining up in a grand sextile with Uranus and Neptune. All three planets are retrograde, but they're working together, which is very helpful. With all of them being retrograde, obviously, all of them working together sort of moves things forward, because in that retrograde, it sort of feels like everything's moving backward in a way. And in terms of how you think about things, this is actually really important, because if Capricorns tend to be on the pessimistic or negative side, it opens things up in terms of your relationships, in terms of your home and how you see it. And it gives you an opportunity to really focus on the positive rather than negative. When you have opportunities to focus your energy on something positive rather than something negative, that is very helpful. If you are a person that tends to focus on the negative more often than the positive, giving yourself the outlet of only focusing on the positive does help, because the more positive you can see, the less negative you can see, if that makes sense. So it is helpful. It's not exciting, I'm afraid, but it's something that I think every human being is required to do in order to move forward, in order to grow, and in order, most importantly, in order to be successful. And when you're a Capricorn, success is really what it's all about. So that is what I have for you guys this week. And I'm going to move on to Aquarius. We still have Saturn in Aquarius in retrograde, in opposition with Venus, and of course squared with Uranus, continuing that big T square at least towards the end of the week. When Venus moves out of a square with Uranus, we just have an opposition between Venus and Saturn. So it really doesn't change anything for us, to be honest with you. For us Aquarians, it just seems to be the same. The good news is that Venus moves out of Leo next week. And then we're just back to having that square with Uranus until that decides to go away, which I think it will by the end of the year. At least I'm pretty sure it does. But let's focus on what we're focused on, which of course is on the mind and how Aquarians think. Do we really want to open that Pandora's box? Because I tell you what, I don't know if I want to open that Pandora's box for myself. Aquarian thinkers, we are head people. We don't really talk about what's going on in our minds. We tend to mull over it over and over again in many cases. We are intellectuals, which is good, as long as we're using that intellect in the right way. And if we're not using it in the right way, then it really isn't good when you think about it. This challenge is really a biggie when you are looking at specifically Uranus's position in relationships, Venus's position in your career. Point blank, you're responsible for your own thought process and your own thought patterns, and how you perceive your responsibilities within your relationships and within your career when you think about it. So in terms of that, it's very important that we look at these things for what they are, and not the crazy way that our imaginations might be making it seem, if that makes sense. Now, let me just explain a little bit further. This is something that I have a lot of experience with, being an Aquarian myself. And a lot of times we'll focus on relationships here. I've been married pretty much for 27 years now. It's a great relationship. I love him to death. He's a wonderful man. We don't see eye to eye, and my first thought is, that's it, I'm done. I'm packing up my stuff and I'm out of here. It is such, I'm telling you, 27 years later, that is always my first thought. Now, if I were to allow that thought to completely run amok and take over, I'd have packed up and left a million times. Instead, I don't allow that thought to take over my actions. I sort of talk myself through, is this really that big of a deal? Am I really in trouble enough to have to leave? I mean, we just had a misunderstanding. And so I kind of sort of talk myself through the process. And I feel that this really is what this is all about. Saturn is retrograde. So we're not talking about other people's responsibility to me. We're talking about my responsibility to me. And really taking a look at just how much of a responsibility am I taking in my career goals? How much of a responsibility am I taking in my relationships? If I'm not taking responsibility or ownership of my own responsibility in the problems that exist in these places, then there's never going to be a solution. And that's really Aquarians are solution oriented people. We want a solution. We don't want a problem. Or if we do have a problem, then the only reason that that problem is good is because we can provide a solution to it. When you get stuck in your head about it, it really makes it difficult to find a solution. So rather than getting stuck in your head, my best advice is to take all of that out of your head and do one of two things. Either one, write it down. When you write it down, all this massive stuff in here becomes like 3 or 4 things. It's really not that big of a deal. Same thing when you talk it out. You know, you were just so upset and thinking that this is such a big deal. And when you start to talk about it, you're in your mind thinking, okay, this is actually not as big of a deal as I thought it was, right? And when that happens, it gives you an opportunity to maybe stop making it bigger than it actually is, because in all honesty, all of that intellect can work against us, and it has worked against us over and over and over again for our entire lives. So it's about managing your intellect, right? The thing about intellectual signs that I find interesting is that I find that most intellectual signs are so smart they're stupid. And what I mean by that is there's so much knowledge in there that when it comes to dealing with basic day-to-day stuff, we can't, right? Like the person walking around trying to find their keys when the keys are in their hand the entire time, right? It's those kind of stupid little things that I'm talking about. And yes, I do them on a regular basis, um, because there is just so much going on in here that we're not paying attention to what we're doing here. And this is really what this challenge is all about for Aquarians this week. If you can get a handle on that, I know you can get a handle on anything. So that is what I have for you guys this week. And we are officially at the end, moving on to Pisces. We still have Neptune in Pisces, of course. Focus is on the home this week, and Neptune's retrograde is still very much important, of course, and luckily lining up in very positive, helpful ways with the other planets, and not any challenges, which is good. We've had enough challenges, I think, for to last us a little while. So we'll be very grateful that there are no challenges in here today. With a grand sextile with Pluto and Uranus this week, Neptune is really showcasing here just how much your mind plays a part in how you see your relationships. Now, this can be a good thing or a bad thing. If we're looking at our relationships with rose-colored glasses, meaning that we are only seeing what we want to see and not seeing what we don't want to see, that is not helpful. Unfortunately, you're going to get sidelined with something that you don't want to see. On the flip side of that, though, you also want to be aware of where you might be making a mountain out of a molehill within certain relationships. And you have to find a balance in between the two, which is always difficult, especially for emotional signs, I feel, because emotional signs feel more than they think. And because they feel more, they're more emotionally, they react emotionally, I feel, a lot more because they tend to feel things through. That doesn't mean that feeling things through is wrong. Actually, you need to in many ways. But I kind of feel in this situation that in terms of your relationships and how your relationships play out, you really want to look at it for what it is. Using your intuition is of course very helpful, because your intuition will kind of sort of provide you with things that maybe you haven't thought of before. And if your intuition is saying something that somebody else is denying, that does not mean that your intuition isn't working. It means that that person may not be very good at speaking their truth or being honest with themselves at the time. And your intuition is going to be really helpful with that. So you do want to pay attention to what your intuition is saying, because that is definitely going to be helpful with what you're dealing with this week, especially in terms of relationships. But rather than looking at difficulties and challenges, actually, this sort of brings together everything that you've been working on towards your relationships in a very positive way. So you also want to pay attention to whether or not your mind is going to a pessimistic place with this as well, because that's always something that can happen. And you want to be aware of that, and you want to take charge of it just in case you need to take charge of it. And so being aware of it is definitely going to make things a lot easier for you in that way. So that is what I have for you guys, and that is what I have overall. I hope that that was helpful for you guys. Hey, enjoy the last week before the Mercury retrograde, because I have a sneaking suspicion that this one is kind of going to be a doozy. Not really looking forward to it. Haven't been looking forward to it all year, but we'll see. I might be totally wrong. Anyways, I'm Melissa Bruce, the Heavy Metal Psychic. Thank you for watching. And hey, I will see you guys next week. Have a good week, everybody.